All right, let's get started. Again, welcome to the Stanford Digital Economy Lab Lunch Seminar. I am Eric Fernald, the director of the lab, and today's seminar speaker is John Fernald, who is of INSEAD Business School now. He has an AB and a PhD from Harvard and a master's degree from the London School of Economics. He's the Schroders Chair of European Competitiveness and Reform and a professor of economics at INSEAD Business School and applied macroeconomist. The Wall Street Journal referred to him as, quote, the Fed's point man on productivity. He's my point man as well. He's everybody's smartest point man on that. He has published in a lot of journals like American Review, Journal of Political Economy, Journal of Monetary Economics, etc. We welcome and encourage questions during the seminar. If you're in the Zoom, please submit your questions using the little Q&A function there at the bottom of your Zoom. And if you're here at Stanford, just raise your hand and Christy or I will call on you. We'll bring you over the mic so that everyone can hear you. So, John, welcome to Stanford. Tell us about productivity during and after the pandemic.
All right. Thank you very much, Eric. I don't know if the volume's a little loud. Might be. I feel like my voice is booming even more than usual, possibly because if I get close to that. Anyway, thank you very much. It really is a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, Eric, for the kind introduction. So my comments today are going to be, well, I guess I should say they're joint with Wei-Yu I say draws on, but sort of the papers I've written related to this particular topic are mostly written with her, although I'll go a little beyond things I've done with her towards the end on some more kind of speculative open topics. So I've spent a lot of time in my career thinking about productivity and how it evolves and trying to make sense of some of the movements, either in the short run or the long run. And this is kind of a good time to try to take stock of where we stand, right? I mean, a lot is happening. A lot is happening in this building, and people are writing about and thinking about, what is it that generative AI is going to do to the productivity statistics in the next few years? So it's a good time to kind of take stock. Where are we right now? And during the pandemic, the particular lens I'll look at, a lot happened. The productivity numbers have been volatile. And at times, people have kind of often overinterpreted short-run movements we've seen. So to kind of preview my takeaway, you can look at the image I have here. So you might think it's a roller coaster, but it's actually not. It's actually a graph of productivity statistics, the level of productivity during the pandemic. So we saw, kind of an exciting soaring of productivity early on, and then a heart-stopping decline that brought us back more or less where we started out. So I'll talk more about why it looked that way and why maybe it wasn't such a surprise to see that kind of pattern in the data. So productivity matters for lots of reasons, right? We usually think about it mattering for in the long run for raising material living standards, our material well-being. But in the short run, it can matter as well in affecting inflation pressures, for example. So during the pandemic, we saw this, right? We saw demand picked up when the economy reopened, and supply couldn't keep pace. Some of it was just bottlenecks that we've been working through, but a healthy dose of productivity would have helped. So in this regard, the Wall Street Journal a few months ago had this article about the economy's odometer is broken. So the pace at which the economy can grow without overheating depends on how productive it is. But productivity figures have turned into a real mess. So that's kind of the what you see a lot in the press and kind of talking about productivity. So I want to make some sense of that mess. I don't think it's as hard to understand as this article would suggest. So I'll start by just sort of a really big picture, kind of looking at the long sweep of history. Then we'll look at the pandemic per se and some of the cyclical influences on productivity in particular that are in many ways predictable cyclical influences. Then we'll talk about a little bit about remote work and work from home. And then at the end, depending how much time we have, I'll have at least a couple of slides where we can talk a little more speculatively, why have the numbers looked the way they have, what are we missing? What kind of measurement issues are, since a number of people in this room have talked about kind of measurement problems, say CP at the back, and Eric, of course, and probably others of you as well. So kind of the big picture is we came into the pandemic on a pretty slow growth trajectory. So one way I would think about this, if I look at data going back to 1947, does the data kind of look like we have regimes of fast growth, say, the pre-1973 period, then a few decades of slower growth, then fast growth again for about a decade, mid-90s to mid-2000s, and then coming into the pandemic, about 15 years of slower productivity growth. So, kind of a little over 3% growth during the fast growth regimes, 1.5-ish in the slow growth regimes. Now, one way economists have sometimes kind of modeled this is as, say, a regime switching model. I mean, it kind of looks like that, and that's sort of how I've often thought about it. And so people who have estimated, say, Markov switching models would estimate that, duration of a regime might be 15, 20 years in expectation. Now, the way this is modeled is, right, if you're in a regime, a Markov switching model would say, there's just some regime switching probability. It's not like we're predicting it's going to change in the near term. It's just, it might change, and we'll see. And then if it does, we're likely to stay in that new regime for a while. Now, sometimes you might think the regime switches are predictable, or we think we can look over the horizon. So to quote Eric a couple of months ago in Fortune magazine, I see a doubling of productivity growth in the coming decade as a result of the new technologies. Well, of course, you look at this figure, okay, so 1.5, you double it, you get to 3. So Eric's forecast, which, I realize it's completely speculative, but it's completely consistent with this kind of regime switch view, where he's seeing over the horizon a regime switch. Now, this is where we were coming into the pandemic. And you can think of lots of things the pandemic might have done and might do. And so we'll talk about that. But at times, people thought, there's a lot of kind of accelerated digital innovation. One of the challenges to digital innovation that Eric and others have written about is the human side of just the resistance to change and culture in businesses. And we had a forced change in the pandemic, and maybe that accelerated things. So if we came into the pandemic on some trajectory, well, maybe there was a level shift. Shift could have been up and down, up or down, and there were arguments on both sides. So maybe the whole level of productivity got shifted up by being forced to learn a new way of doing business, being forced to kind of accelerate ideas that were there and technologies that were available, but that we hadn't been using. So that would be an example where maybe we would jump up to some new path. And maybe there were productivity benefits from working from home. And early on, you heard that. But for all, one of the amazing things is we were able to keep producing at all. Like businesses shut down their physical operations, and yet we kept producing. So that in and of itself was amazing. And maybe it's because people were more productive at home. Now, the evidence on that is much more mixed. I'll come back to that. I don't see a big productivity gain or loss from kind of the shift we've seen. And I think that's more or less consistent with Nick Bloom and his collaborators' findings, where some tasks, some firms, workers are more productive. Other times they're less productive, and other tasks they're less productive at. Now, regardless of all kind of these things, we know the pandemic was disruptive in many ways, right? We faced supply chain problems. Businesses face problems with monitoring, coordinating. So this could lead to a shift down the other way. So it could go either way. Now, there could also be a growth rate effects. I won't talk much about that because there are other things beyond the pandemic that are going on that are probably more important for the future of growth. The whole kind of generative AI is kind of a new thing. We're all figuring out what it means for businesses. One thing I will just at least note on the adverse side is there was obviously a big disruption to education in the pandemic. And some kids are not going to get educated to the degree they will. High school dropout rates are lower. Enrollment rates in high school, people still not showing up apparently. So that's going to have a long tail of effects on kind of the educational attainment of the labor force. So some work I did with Wei-Yu Lee, we tried to quantify, like, how big might the productivity impact of that be? In growth rate terms, it's not, it's kind of a level effect drawn out over a long period of time. In growth rate terms, it's not huge. It's a few basis points a year, but it accumulates. And so eventually it becomes, half a percentage point or something. Important, and especially important for the people who are affected, maybe not that central for relative to the other things that move the growth rate around. It's going to be a small but present headwind. So all of these things could be going on. But what actually did we see? So let's talk about what the data look like, where we see a boom and then a bust. So now I'm plotting the level of labor productivity, or the log level, for the US since the mid-90s. So what I put in is a slowdown after 2004, a change in the trend to take account of what we saw before, the change in trend. So you see growth steadily, it slows, some wiggles around the Great Recession. But here's where we were coming into the pandemic. And that's at the end of 2019. 2020, productivity soars. This is the upside of the roller coaster. Productivity took off. And so certainly there were, this is the period in which we saw, headlines like, are we on the cusp of a new roaring 20s? Maybe the pandemic was the shock we needed to disrupt us from, the stagnation that we were seeing in the previous 15 years. And why? Well, the pandemic opened up new business habits, new ways of doing business, new models. And kind of the forced or accelerated digital innovation overcame some of the barriers to technology adoption. And so that's kind of the arguments you saw in the press. Then we got a couple quarters of bad growth, and you started seeing articles, why the productivity boom isn't over. Well, this was kind of at the end of 2020, early 2021. It just reverted right back to its pre-pandemic slow trend. In fact, a little bit below the pre-pandemic slow trend. So that's where we are now. We're a little below where we were, where you would have predicted in 2019 on productivity. Yep, Q3. Yep, that's that little nice upward flip. Now, one thing I would note about these data is I average the income and expenditure side measures of GDP. The national accounts produce two measures. The official productivity side statistics just have the expenditure side, and the income side, which early in the pandemic was stronger than the expenditure side. Past year, it's been weaker. We don't have Q3 income side data yet, but I think if you looked at just the expenditure side, the past year has been much, much stronger. But it means you're not below the trend; you're closer to.
Right. Last quarter was 4.7% annual rate.
Yeah, something like that.
And that doesn't really show up. It doesn't.
Yeah, it doesn't. It does look like it should.
Yeah, okay.
I have to check that because it looks like that should have been above the faster. It should have lifted us above the trend.
But it's just one quarter. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
And that since the mid 80s, I guess, TFP is now acyclical and labor productivity is countercyclical. If that's true, this is also the pattern you would expect from that, right? Like COVID recession.
Yeah, so that's a great question. It is exactly what, since the mid 80s pattern, you would expect. So, oops. Oh, yeah. So I'm going to actually, I'll come back to that in just a moment, and we'll talk exactly about that. Yeah, I mean, TFP has become much less. Well, we'll show you the numbers actually.
You have your own measure.
What's that?
You have your own measure about.
Yeah, but I mean, it's true however you measure it. And yeah, that's right, because you look at, so to that your point. Oops. Yeah. unemployment went up and productivity went up. Will you go back to the Great Recession? Unemployment went up and productivity went up. Yeah, and so I'll actually show you that relationship in a moment. It looks just like the Great Recession. The pattern looks just like the Great Recession, only kind of accelerated because the unemployment shot up and came down very fast. You see a similar pattern in Europe, which, by the way, productivity was not countercyclical in Europe in the Great Recession. So this is a little different. So here's the euro area, excluding France. I'll show you in a moment why. See, they saw the same kind of thing. They shot above their pre-pandemic trend, came right back to trend, maybe a little below trend. Now, I excluded France from this because France just looks like a disaster in terms of productivity. They remain 4% below where they were in 2019. I don't completely understand the French case. A lot of it is just employment has been really strong. They've been very effective at bringing people who were outside the labor market back in through apprenticeships and other things. So I think a lot of it is that workers they've been bringing back in are workers who are less productive. But that's sort of a good thing if you're getting people who should be in the labor market back having labor market attachment. Yep.
Yeah, this is you mentioned France also.
Yes. So since you mentioned France, what also might be compelling would be comparing with Canada, since what has been pretty consistent in the Canadian situation is productivity, even since the 90s, even earlier, has been consistently lagging that of the United States. And actually, to many Canadians, the Canadian economists, it's been somewhat puzzled as why. So whether it's issue of housing markets, whether it's lack of integration, for example, whether is it not having as well integrated of a single market as the US does compared to just how the Canadian federal system set versus the US one, number of these things, but it's been somewhat puzzle for many comments in Canada about why it's still lagging. And unlike the US, where wage growth has actually been above inflation, Canada, they've actually lost 10 percentage points against inflation on the wage growth side in the last decade. So,
yeah.
So that would also be something compelling too.
Yeah. No, every country is interesting. That's a great point and different, right? I mean, this highlights, and maybe Canada would highlight that as well. I don't know how they've looked in the pandemic or since, but I mean, the trends across countries and the diffusion of ideas across countries has been, should be, ideas should diffuse. And so then there's arguments about, well, why hasn't it, or why is it hitting different countries at different ways? But broadly, advanced economies all saw slow productivity growth coming into the pandemic. Sometimes there are differences and nuances. Yeah. But broadly, you look across advanced economies, the same pattern kind of looks true. So this is now advanced economies back to the 1950s, the growth rate. It's a 4-year moving average from the Conference Board Total Economy database. Kind of looks like, it's kind of, the period when countries were converging, productivity growth was 4%, stepped down to like 2%, stepped down further to like 1% across all advanced economies. And the 2019 to 2023, basically nothing. I mean, just the same as it was before the pandemic. So most countries look like the same, plus or minus the same kind of slow growth trajectory. So now let's come to this question about well, is this just predictable cyclical things? To which I'm going to say yes. A lot of those big movements were what you'd expect, given the countercyclicality of labor productivity that we've seen since the mid-'80s. So let's just estimate a super simple cyclical regression, right? There's nothing structural. It's just progressing labor productivity growth on 4-quarter change of the unemployment rate. And this is the fitted value up to 2019. So it kind of picks up this countercyclicality. Unemployment went up, productivity went up. Well, if we use this same fitted, and that, of course, then as unemployment came down, productivity, kind of returned to its trend. Here's what it looks like if we use the same estimated regression line, and that we estimated, and use the unemployment rate to predict what labor productivity should be after 2019. Looks just like the data. It's like, in some sense, it's like fits remarkably well, right? It's kind of a completely just reduced form relationship, But the same reduced form relationship that saw productivity kind of go up after the pandemic, go up kind of in the aftermath of the Great Recession, and then kind of come back to trend, works just in a faster way now because the unemployment rate movements were so fast. So a lot of this was just kind of predictable cyclicality.
Do you want to say anything about that coefficient 0.84? It's almost like if you lay off a worker, they weren't really doing a whole lot.
Right, well, yes, except that
If you go back,
yeah, no, I'm trying to, right, I'm thinking about the
delta.
Yeah, I mean, because you actually, so employment actually falls more than 1-for-1 with unemployment, because people who had second jobs, for example, lose them. And hours worked tend to fall when the unemployment rate goes up. So hours worked tends to fall about 2% when the unemployment rate goes up a percentage point. So a 2% drop in hours is, well, yeah, or 2 or 1 point, so yeah, gets you
1%,
1.6% increase in productivity, something like that.
Of why the cyclicality of TFP flipped and like what like the real world story is.
Yeah.
It's countercyclical.
Yeah, so we can look at kind of think about why productivity moves, right? So labor productivity, often people put some version of an accounting. There's some sometimes you'll do capital deepening in terms of capital output ratios, which sort of work sensible in the long run. This is just I'm going to think about capital relative to composition adjusted labor, sort of plus maybe a composition, kind of the skills and education of the workforce, or TFP. So all of these things can matter. So it's always been the case that capital deepening and labor composition are countercyclical, right? Capital deepening is kind of one way to think of it is you're moving down the demand curve, the labor demand curve, or up the labor demand curve, and so marginal products change. But kind of mechanically, hours worked move a lot in the business cycle. Capital doesn't, so hours worked fall. Capital deepening goes up, right? So that term kind of mechanically is giving you a countercyclical movement to productivity. That economy goes down, productivity goes up. Labor composition, I think who disproportionately loses their jobs in a downturn is especially people with less education, less experience. So the composition of the labor force who are working shift towards people who are more, who are kind of have lower marginal product.
Was that different 50 years ago?
So both of those were there. I can't remember. I know I've looked at this and I can't remember how it's changed. But it's really the TFP one that is the only piece that has a strong pro-cyclical movement. And that's become less pro-cyclical. I would say it's still pro-cyclical for the most part, but it's kind of depends a lot on how you try to measure the cyclicality of it.
You had labor unions or something, and then union power goes down. So then your story like takes sharper effect, where the firms fire a bunch of the worst workers, and then the story holds, but it might not have held in a regime in which like unions or something prevented the sort of firing of like low marginal product workers.
I think that would go right. I mean, so that would go the same way, right? I'm not taking a stand right now on kind of which the story is, because part of some of that literature, like why is the cyclicality changed, is about like what's kind of why do you see a different mix of the different effects, of kind of the different cyclicality of these things, like the usual argument about why is TFP just pro-cyclical? Why does it has to do with factor utilization, right? Labor effort, capitalist work week. So if that margin, if firms are using that margin a little less intensively, that can matter. Industrial composition can matter, right? If it's especially notable in manufacturing, and so and so as we shift it away from manufacturing, that utilization margin can become less important, and kind of that's kind of the predictable business cycle effect. Shocks can matter too. Now, some of the literature is really about changes in the nature of shocks. And that's sort of why it's a little surprising, the pandemic looked like the Great Recession. The shocks are really different. So one of the ways that thinks about is it are you getting technology shocks, or are you getting like monetary shocks and demand shocks? Or if you have a demand shock, true technology isn't changing. All you're getting is movements like in factor utilization, kind of the intensity of how hard you're working people, the work and the work week of capital. Right? So you get more pro-cyclical productivity maybe out of that. So the nature of shocks can matter. But the point you kind of raised, I think, is completely right. The pro-cyclical aspects of TFP have become less important, to the point that it's sort of a lot, whether it's still a little pro-cyclical or not, it's or whether it's now acyclical. Well, if that's acyclical and these things are counter-cyclical, you're just left with this term that is kind of mechanically counter-cyclical. Yeah, and I think that's a lot of what's going on, right? It's the challenge of trying to interpret long-run trends from short-term movements in labor productivity. Yeah, these things are so volatile anyway, but there are a bunch of predictable things that aren't about technology at all. Yeah, and sometimes people forget that. So if we look at the productivity data, now I've just the same kind of bar chart I had before. Now the bar chart just starts in 95, right? So they have fast growth. Here I've broken the post-2004 into a couple of different sub-bars. The average pace is the black line. It's been 1.4 or something. So slow before the Great Recession, a little bit faster during the Great Recession, slower. The pandemic, 2020, we got that boom, and then it's kind of been negative in the 11 quarters since the end of 2020. Here's the growth accounting decomposition of it. So you can kind of see kind of mechanically, in a growth accounting sense, what drove it. Then we can think, well, what can we say about these pieces? So the boom in 2020, a big chunk was capital deepening, more capital per hour worked. Now, intuitively, part of that, what was going on, was an industry shift, a kind of industry mix, right? We shifted, industries like restaurants that are low capital intensity shut down. They're low levels of productivity. And the growth accounting, we'd say, well, how does that show up in growth accounting? That's capital deepening, right? You shut them down, more capital intensive industries, kind of.
It's almost not capital deepening so much as labor shallowing, right? Right. Well, it sounds like it's less a matter of adding capital and more a matter of subtracting labor. So the net capital per labor went up.
Right. So you could look at it as well. We shut down low level of productivity industries. The growth accounting will say, well, yeah, maybe you want to say it's labor shallowing, but it's really kind of why was restaurants low productivity, because they don't have a lot of capital per worker. So the growth accounting is going to attribute it to capital.
Right. There's two ways to get more capital per worker.
That's right.
More capital or less.
Oh, that's right. Yep.
Yeah, forgive me, this is already sort of common knowledge, but to what extent was there real capital deepening due to people just deferring consumption till after the pandemic? It kind of seemed to me when it was starting to unfold that this would be an important dynamic. Like if people can't leave their houses, then they'll just sort of, if they're still working, they'll pile up the capital, they'll consume it afterward. But I haven't really heard that discussed.
I don't know, but I'm not sure I completely understood the question about kind of
they'll just be more saving
the capital. Right. So they're going to save more, but you still got the cap. You still got the worst. One aspect is you're not really measuring. One thing that Jan Epperly, I forget who her co-author on this paper is, maybe Jonathan Haskell. We're talking about is we're mismeasuring the capital stock. Right, because we're missing the home. We shifted from office capital to home capital, but a lot of then the office capital was idle, as you kind of essentially had kind of duplicate capital. So that's kind of an interesting measurement issue. Is maybe some home capital should actually be added to the business capital. But yeah, there's a lot people made a lot of decisions about changing their patterns of consumption because of this, saving for a while, right? So that's sort of a big adverse demand shock. And that's part of why, firms didn't need labor in the second quarter of 2020 and shut down. And yeah, but we still had the capital, we still had the capacity, so the businesses that were operating, had more higher capital output ratios. That's kind of what this was saying. Yeah.
And has there been much comparison since this reminded me quite a lot of a presentation panel with Professor Leo String, he's been doing a lot around labors back in July of 2020, and he made this comparison, and this was still when it was pretty deep in the pandemic, July 2020. He made this comparison of the situation around the Second World War, that post-war, what he argued, the fact that if you compare US and UK, the fact that the US managed to sustain that level of stimulus, even during the war years, even from Depression on, whereas the UK, when they started letting off, in fact, in the UK in the late 40s, the rationing was even worse than it was during the war period. And bread wasn't rationed during war, but it became rationed in the 5 years after the war. Whereas in the US, of course, there were this volatility, looking at the numbers of employment and industrial output with demobilization and such. But overall, you didn't get that slump that you would have seen in, for example, like the UK and other places. So in this situation, especially with the post-pandemic, given that compared to much of Europe, the US was actually a lot more vigorous, a lot more proactive when it came to a stimulus, actually ensuring people still had money to spend, even though things were locked down. What we're seeing now, could it just be the deferred spending, much like post-war in the 40s, that then is powering what we're seeing as the increase in the GDP numbers?
So that's an interesting point. Like the U.S. got more stimulus, has grown faster since the pandemic, right? So it's done better since the pandemic than Europe has. What's interesting is Europe and the U.S. on productivity,
and also lower inflation as well.
But they've also had another shock, right? They've also had the hit much harder by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the war there, and by kind of the energy price shock. So the U.S. got more stimulus, has grown, GDP growth has grown faster, but productivity, in the U.S. looks like it's back to trend. Europe, it looks like it's kind of back to trend. So the productivity numbers, it doesn't look as different.
There's a question from online about how you measure labor quality, and I think it relates to your earlier question about composition. Actually, to me, it's a little surprising that during the dip, labor quality continued to.
Yeah. So you mean this part?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Because I haven't told you. So
if given what you said about composition, but yeah, just maybe you could say a minute about how you measure it.
So labor composition is trying to get at, or here traditionally called labor quality, going back to Jorgensen and Grillicus in 1967, is trying to basically look at the composition of the labor force according to observable characteristics like education and experience. And you can look at and relating these, trying to infer relative marginal products from relative wages. So that's kind of, so you can try to measure this. This is the measure here is what I put in my quarterly TFP series, which is sort of based on a series from the CPS or a method that Aronson and Sullivan did. The CPS, one thing I would note is the CPS is really volatile in terms of, it looks like there's a lot of measurement error in the composition of the labor force. So you kind of broadly do pretty well. I'm a little nervous about this number. To your point, why is it so strong since? Surely it should have reversed. For the last few quarters, it's measured as being super strong. And so it's, so I'm worried.
All those workers are being rehired that are working in.
Yeah, because if I'd done this a little bit more finely, right, I kind of did this of crude category 2020. The labor quality bar for the second quarter of 2020 shot up more faster than you've ever seen, right? Lower education, lower experience workers got hammered. And then, for most of the, the next 2 plus years, it reversed. So it's actually been pretty strong overall since here. So kind of suggests that it's still a tougher labor market. The composition has shifted towards people who have more education and experience. But yeah, I mean, I'm a little worried about that bar, right? Now, if that bar's wrong, it would change the TFP number, but then the TFP number is not going to be great.
And then we shouldn't lose sight of what you said earlier about what's happening to all those people who had less education, but that's something, as you said, is basis points over a decade or more of effect. Yeah.
Right. I mean, the initial effect is probably good for potential output, because the people that don't graduate from high school and don't go on to college enter the labor force. You might get more hours work by people with not much experience. So our effects on output kind of kick in after about 2030. What's that?
The effects on output being negative.
The negative effects on output. Now, productivity of labor composition, this sort of labor composition term is always going to be held back a little bit for the next 50 years or something. Kind of until those people, the people who got affected are completely out of the labor force. Yeah, but anyway, so things kind of reverse. I mean, yeah, you pointed out the labor composition piece doesn't look like it really reversed. It's kind of sensitive to how you do the timing on that. But capital deepening clearly reversed, right? And that's been a big negative. Now, TFP, actually in blue, kind of still looks like it was adding a lot in 2020 and then subtracting since. There's a lot of cyclicality still in that, right? So the second quarter of 2020, TFP was terrible. Then it bounced back. All of the qualitative evidence and some quantitative evidence suggests there was probably a lot of, on balance in 2020, people were working really hard. People who had jobs were working really hard. I have a utilization measure, which not necessarily a great one, but it kind of suggests that after the second quarter, utilization shot up. But the qualitative things, people felt getting burned out, and then starting to do quiet quitting and working less hard at work, and that shows up in the TFP number. So that's a kind of a cyclical mismeasurement factor that affects the productivity numbers. So, I'm not sure, wouldn't take a lot from those bits, but I think this is kind of looks like qualitatively, the broad picture we've seen looks sort of like the recession and early recovery, where you saw a lot of capital deepening and increases in labor composition. The next, kind of then the period when we think, oh, productivity was so bad, right? In the decade before, it's kind of below its trend because you were unwinding some of that capital deepening and labor composition. So labor productivity, has these other things that are hard to interpret. So I kind of think we're kind of where we, we're still working things out. There's still disruptions, and businesses are still figuring out, how hybrid work will work. But what kind of seemed like a lot of the movements we saw are just these predictable cyclical movements. So let me now turn kind of the next kind of substantive thing, maybe final substantive thing I want to kind of focus on is just looking at remote work. There are a lot of studies of this. Nick Bloom, and his collaborators, and maybe other people here are kind of the world's experts on this. But a lot of it is on looking at particular narrow companies and particular tasks where you can really measure kind of what's going on. So we want to so in work with Huayu, what we do is we try to look at all industries, and the idea is some industries have a lot of telework is really easy. And there's we don't really, now the problem when you look across industries is you don't have really good measures of how much actual telework is being done. We know today, something like, according to Nick and company, like 30% of working days are done remotely. But some industries are disproportionately doing it. So if you look at data processing, right? So that's something where the top 3 occupations are like software developers, customer service, and computer support specialists that, according to work by Dingle and Nyman, are 100% teleworkable. So in there, so if you look at the occupations in this, 3/4 of the work in that industry is teleworkable, or of the occupations are telework, 100% teleworkable. So that's an industry which, if you'd think, and the evidence suggests, do a lot more telework and remote work than an industry like accommodation services, where 90% of the work has to be done in person. You have no option to do it remotely, right? You've got building cleaning workers, desk clerks, wait staff. These are the most important occupations. They have to be done in person. So what we can do is the reason this is a useful way to look at it is you can look at every industry and rank it by teleworkability. And there's at least some evidence that the actual telework that gets done by different industries is related to how teleworkable it is. Well, so what we can do is relate industry teleworkability, from 0 to, I guess, 85% on the horizontal axis against labor productivity growth during the pandemic. So we know we can get labor productivity by industry, this point up to the first quarter of this year. We know labor productivity is imperfect, right? I just spent a little bit of time talking about the cyclical influences on it. But by this time, maybe it's worn out a bit. It's sort of a lot of the cyclical pattern maybe has disappeared the way it looks like by now we're in the aggregate data. So if you look at it just this way, you see accommodation and food services and data processing, productivity growth is faster in data processing. Okay, and there's a upward sloping line that is in fact statistically significant. But I'll say one more thing, and I'll let you ask your question, Eric. This does not account for the fact that, what was happening before the pandemic. If we look at kind of what happened in the pandemic relative to what happened 2006 to 2019, so the period where we can get the data, then you can look at excess pandemic labor productivity growth on the vertical axis. And there's essentially no relationship. So what's nice about this is we can look at the entire economy and say, there's no apparent relationship between teleworkability and excess pandemic productivity growth. Now, lots of things are going on, in these data, and maybe even one way you might look at it is, boy, there's a lot of volatility in the industry productivity experience, right? Got kind of a minus 20% a year pace. I forget what industry that is, or so there's a lot of variability, but it just doesn't seem to be related to telework and teleworkability. Do you want to?
Actually, you anticipated my question. I was figuring that data processing probably had faster growth than restaurants before the pandemic too, and you just showed that.
Yeah, right. All right. So that's kind of the substantive part of what did the data look like. So I have now a couple more slides, hopefully a little more open conversation that are a little bit more about kind of measurement issues and maybe time to kind of speculate about the future. So things where probably everyone here has an opinion, hopefully a bunch of different opinions. So I've been showing you data that's just kind of the standard data, either output in the business sector per hour worked, or decomposing it, say, into TFP and capital deepening and labor composition. But you can think of a lot of measurement issues and challenges with measurement. And these are things that I know people in this room have worked a lot on. So the biggest issue of question, as people have looked at it recently, is just has measurement gotten worse? We've always had mismeasurement. And so that's kind of where you can identify mismeasurement in all sorts of areas, but it's not clear it's gotten worse. I mean, that's sort of a paper I wrote argued we didn't find a lot of evidence that things were, that the slow pace since 2004 reflected mismeasurement. But the measurement problems aren't getting easier. And in some ways, maybe they're going to keep getting harder. And so we've got to kind of keep trying, so it's a continual race to try to figure this out. So, conceptually, you can mismeasure inputs, right? Like with TFP, we're mismeasuring kind of the cyclical effort that's being done, right? That's an input that's varying, but that the statistics don't measure. You always have to worry, are we measuring kind of the quality and composition of the inputs properly? We might not be. But a lot of the work has been on output. Like, Eric has pushed hard. We're missing a lot of the benefits of free digital goods, a lot of the services we get through the internet, through our phones, and so forth. It's hard to argue with that. At one level, it doesn't help us with, even if that helps kind of overall consumer welfare or GDP in a broader sense, in terms of like productivity of the business sector itself, it doesn't necessarily help us. Some of it will bleed into there, but it says, maybe we're getting a lot of stuff outside of the business sector, this consumer surplus from having an infinite supply of free cat videos, which I get a lot of consumer surplus from. Certainly Pete has worked a lot on missing quality of different sorts, including through gains in variety. So that's something that's always been there. But I think, by and large, like the work of yours, with sets of co-authors, doesn't find that big. Doesn't find that the effects got a lot larger after 2004 or 5 thereabouts. Profit shifting is one as well. That a lot of businesses have an incentive to shift their intellectual property, say, to Ireland, and book as much of the value added as they can in Ireland. But that looks like a huge effect before about 2007, and a much smaller effect since. So it doesn't. It kind of says the fast growth period might have been even a little bit faster. All right, so there are lots of things like this you can look at. The thing I think is sort of the big open question, that Eric's been pushing for, I don't know, not quite 30 years, probably 20 years, 25 years, this kind of productivity J curve, right? That and broadly, which is I think of as a category of intangible investment. So by any measure, intangible investments that businesses do, things where they spend money hoping to get a benefit in the future, has probably gotten more important, in ways that are intangible, kind of organizational change, for example. So there are different ways people try to measure that. But a point Eric long ago emphasized was, you invest a lot today, you don't see any output, right? But it's a form of intangible output. It should be in the output numbers, and then you get a stock of capital and you get a benefit from that. And so when you're doing a lot of the investment, productivity numbers will be held down. Then you should get the benefit. So there's evidence of that with computers. It's part of maybe why we're doing a lot in the decades before 95, and then we saw the benefit. And maybe we're going to see that in the next few years, even if it's not that big a thing here. Even if it's not yet the dominant factor. So one more kind of just purely speculative. You can, lots of different views, lots of people in this room who have worked on these kinds of issues. I mean, it's sort of useful as we think looking forward. Like, we're thinking like, will AI break us out of this? Well, it's useful to think, why are we as slow? Why have we been as slow as we were? So, there's a broad literature that has looked at that. Why have we had this 15 years of slow productivity growth when we thought, innovation was happening faster than ever? And it kind of, lots of people have argued things that it depends on the nature of technology, the nature of productivity, and it depends on the economic environment, the competitive environment, the regulatory environment. So there are a lot of things that have played into that, that people have put at. So, the Bob Gordon view is we've seen incredible advances in a pretty narrow part of the economy, right? Kind of media and IT, and IT and communications. You might interpret that as, we've gotten a lot of benefits from that, but you might interpret it as, we've changed how we live more than how businesses have operated, more than how we work. I mean, we've seen changes in how we work, but maybe those have been more gradual and incremental. There's the Bloom et al. View of ideas getting harder to find. Maybe it's just the problem is it's just getting harder. We have to work harder and harder even to stay in the same place. There's the Clino Aguillon et al. Of Huiyu Li and others argument that in some sense IT itself reduced the incentive to innovate. Right? You saw a burst of productivity for a while, but then the high productivity firms were had kind of expanded into new areas, and now if they expanded again, they're going to be facing another high productivity firm, and potential new entrants had low incentive to innovate as well because they'd have to overcome a really productive firm. So in some sense, IT sowed the seeds of its own demise. You got a temporary boost, but not a permanent one. Other stories, intangibles as a barrier to entry or something like that. Other stories of, that knowledge diffusion's gotten harder because of, kind of more intellectual property protection and kind of bigger, businesses are able to build bigger moats. These sorts of things, are kind of all could be playing it. So now we come to, well, how are these relevant as we contemplate like a new future with, large language models and generative AI? Some of them may still be true. Now, Ethan Mollick gave, I thought, a great talk here, about a month ago about, generative AI and what it might mean for education and business. He knows, 100 times more than I do about the effects of generative AI on productivity. And he started his talk by saying, no one knows anything. So I think that means even he would think he knows nothing. But he does know 100 times more than I do. So this is this interesting thing, right? It's like, oops, I've skipped sorry. Maybe we're going to get the positive J curve. Maybe we're going to learn a lot. We'll see things just a little ways off. But, we could also think, well, maybe we're better at every task, but what task are we doing? Are businesses who are successful going to create new barriers to entry? And so these are the sorts of things that might matter, but we don't know.
Great. I think we have some time for questions.
Yeah. Well, let me just quickly. I'll.
Oh, yeah.
I have one more slide.
Sorry about that.
Sorry. I was kind of
wrapping.
It did seem like I was wrapping up. I thought you were about to ask a question. So just to take away, right? So, productivity so far seems consistent with the slow underlying trend. We rode this roller coaster up and down, but, to stretch that analogy a little more, roller coasters drop you off where they picked you up. And that's kind of what we've seen. There are a lot of uncertainties. We can take the rest of the time to talk about them. But as we move forward, it's important to kind of ground our speculation, ground our analysis in the data, what it's showing us, and what might be missing from it. So thanks very much.
Great, thank you. Questions? Let me start off with one. So on your previous slide, you had a point, may change how we live more than how we work. And for much of the 20th century and before, like if you've got more, cars or haircuts, whatever that you were paying for, that affected your welfare and well-being. But if you get, as you mentioned, you get a lot of free goods, and Americans spend like more than half their waking hours consuming stuff digitally from different size screens. A lot of that doesn't show up in the GDP and therefore productivity, but affects how they live. And it would be interesting to have you, say more about how whether productivity as we conventionally measure it is becoming less and less of a metric of our changes in our living standards.
Yeah, I mean the challenge is better than probably better than anyone is it's really hard to measure these things, right? It's like and it could be but how you measure it depends somewhat on exactly kind of what structure you put in the problem. Like is social media we spend vast amounts of time on social media. Does it make us better off or worse off? Right? I mean, people, what was this? I know Fox EU had a piece the other day. People, you'd have to pay people a bunch of money to pay young people not to be on TikTok, under the assumption that their friends stayed on TikTok. But in fact, if you shut down TikTok entirely, they'd be willing to pay to have you do that. Because so it's sort of like this negative network externality. It doesn't seem like it's made teenagers happier. In fact, because now they're busy comparing themselves to other people. So, so you can argue whether some of the benefits are positive or even negative. You can't help yourself, or you kind of, in a society where everyone else around you is using these things. And now other ones, other aspects seem more clearly, positive. But we're in a world where, it's been noted, like you can look up you can find any fact you want instantaneously, but no one knows anything. Right. And it's like, so we have more, maybe it fosters some of the political divisions we see and the differences of opinion. So it's good sort of challenging. So at least if we keep it narrowly on like the stuff that does get produced and sold, so more of kind of the business sector. I mean, then maybe where, this is just what we're measuring, that part of things, we're not getting better. And then we can debate how much better we are from everything else. I mean, clearly, we're better off on net. That's my take on it, despite my caveats. But businesses, maybe the numbers just don't show it there.
We have some questions.
Jose Ramon Enriquez is asking online, could you please elaborate further on the link between productivity growth and income inequality, especially in the context of disparities in technology access / teleworkability of occupations during and after the pandemic? This is not just for individual economies, but also across different economies.
Yeah, rising income inequality has been one of the obviously huge challenges that society, almost every country has faced, worse in some countries than others, and the U.S., perhaps worst of all. And the pandemic and some of the shifts we saw, maybe it didn't lead that much to productivity changes, but it's had it's hit lower educated children or lower income children worse. They had less. The educational hit has been harder. That's going to affect future generations. Sort of changed the job market, but right now jobs are, I think the evidence is wages have, since the pandemic have been a little bit more equal. In the sense that low wages have risen faster than high wages have, but there are a lot of reasons for that. So technology probably has exacerbated some of the income inequality issues. Yeah.
So I just wanted to ask if you thought there was a role for a slowdown in labor force growth, if that means less growth in researchers, the Chad Jones, that plays a role in your forecast much.
Yeah, Chad, right? Chad's talked about that as a big headwind in the sense, where do ideas come from? Ideas come from people. As productivity has turned to, as labor force slows and potentially even reach peak population, that's not so good for idea innovation. But I haven't put that into my model so much. I tend to think of it as, kind of the way thinking. As Chad has put it, we've grown faster than the steady state for, since the Industrial Revolution. And now, thinking of other papers of, so I've sort of taken them as separate in many ways for at least the short-term forecasting ideas. But now, kind of as Chad would also say, well, maybe AI is going to relax that constraint on idea generation. And that's, but of course, if I think of, say, his models or other models, a lot of things could happen.
All right. Well, thank you very much, John. That was terrific.
Thank you, Aaron.
That was a great note to end on. We got a great seminar to end our quiz for the fall. It's the last one of the fall, so I hope you all have a great Thanksgiving and holidays. And we will review